But when I always take my cues from our ancestors, my Christian ancestors, who had to answer this question while enslaved. And one of the things that they did is they actually didn't start with the Pauline passages. In other words, they got to choose the ground upon which they wanted to answer this question. And you can see a couple of things they taught me that were instructive. There's this letter that's written to the representatives, and one's in Massachusetts and the other one's in Connecticut, right around the time, because this is really about black people, right? We know what's underneath this. It's about, they wrote it to the House of Representatives in Connecticut. And they said, you know, you're about to have this war to have equality. How can you have this war towards equality when you enslave black people? And then they said something that was really, really interesting. They said, in the Bible, it says that the children should submit to their parents. How can a child submit to his parents if you can sell them? And it says that a husband's supposed to be faithful to his wife and the wife is to their husband. How can that be the case if you can break up their marriage? In other words, they didn't just make the argument about the reinterpretation of certain prohibition passages. They spoke about how the whole of the Bible and the Christian vision of society speaks against slavery. They even spoke about when Paul says, they said, these are enslaved people writing to other Christians. Paul says we're supposed to bear one another's burdens to so fulfill the law of Christ. How can I bear your burden when you force me to do so? And so what they're showing you is the question isn't just what this particular text says, it is what does the Bible reveal. And then you begin to have to ask yourself these questions, right? You have to begin to ask the questions the slaves began to ask when they first encountered this text. When I see God creating the world, does it seem like God created a world in which he intended people to be enslaved? And the answer to that question is no. Well, then where does slavery come from? Slavery is the product of the fall. It is a manifestation of human evil, not what God intends. The other thing that you could begin to see when you look at this thing is if you go through most of the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's two themes that they return to over and over again, and this is important. God made the world, God redeemed the Jews from slavery. So whenever things were bad, they would say, I remember, things are bad, but remember, he brought us out of Egypt, he did it once, he'll do it again. That becomes the moral reasoning that begins to seep into the consciousness of Israel. You also have God himself say, when you get a foreigner and these people, it's like, treat them well. Why? Because you should remember that you were slaves in Egypt. So here's an amazing thing. God creates a people for whom their founding story is the liberation of slavery. Maybe that reveals his fundamental disposition towards reality more than some of those other passages. So in other words, you can either explain away the Exodus and say that wasn't God's real opinion, he wanted us to enslave one another, or there's something else going on in some of these passages. Well, then what is going on in some of these passages? And I make this distinction in both the laws and the Torah and in Paul's own writings, and not to stop speaking about it here. But there's a difference between laws to reveal what God wanted us to be and God that limits the damage that we do to one another in a fallen world. And I think that what you see is, in all of these places, what you see God doing both in the Old Testament and the New Testament is limiting the damage that we do to one another. And what I want you to understand is, especially when it comes to someone like Paul and Peter, there's a difference between what Paul and Peter says and what we're allowed to imagine. In other words, Paul and Peter are writing to a church with no social, cultural, or political power in a tyranny where they couldn't vote or do anything. But what is the responsibility of a Christian nation in a representative democracy where you can change the laws? I'll say one last thing, and this is one of my favorite analogies, and then forgive me. Y'all, how many of y'all, and I'm not trying to be mean, I just want you, and I'm even trying to push this stuff aside, I want us to think for a second and kind of reason like adults. How many of us have cell phones or computers? Now, I think all of us know where these cell phones come from, right? They come from the majority world. And we know that those cell phones are built in factories that exploit their workers. And if it's not your cell phones, it's your clothes. If it's not your clothes, it's your shoes. If it's not your shoes, your computer. And we know these things. So what do? We actually poke at the edges of it. Oh man, I'm going to go to the thrift store, and so that makes it a little bit worse. I'm going to buy some Toms, and they donate a part of it. If something is really egregious, we'll get mad at Apple for a week or two, and then we'll come back. One day, we're going to figure out, and here's the thing, God forbid that anybody here questions capitalism, that lives on the exploitation of people, and we're all caught up in its web and we can't escape. And so what do we do as Christians? What do? We know these things. All of us know. Well, we do these small things to kind of calm our consciences while pointing our finger at the Apostle Paul. And one day, someone's going to look back at us in the year of our Lord 2021 and say, how did these Christians allow this to happen? It is because we can't actually imagine an economy that functions without the exploitations of others. And if we're stuck in this kind of place when we have cultural and economic power, maybe what Paul was dealing with is more complicated than we give him credit for. And then maybe begin to ask questions of what Paul did when he had power, when he is engaging with Philemon and Onesimus. When he has power, he actually, in my opinion, intervenes on behalf of the enslaved person and says, you should set him free. And what about in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where he says to the slaves, if you can get free, do so. So it seems to be the case that when Paul had an opportunity to intervene on behalf of people who were in slavery, he did so. It seems like he also said to the slaves, if you can get free, do so. But it also seems like Paul, and this is the part that you have to wrestle with, is trying to make sense of a world in which slavery is the economic reality. And the last thing I'll say about this, though, it is amazing that Paul thought that the gospel had an impact on that, right? That every aspect of our lives have to be rethought in the light of the gospel. And if we had a whole lot of time, we'd go into the ways in which Paul talks about those things. And the last part I'll do as the caveat, I'm not saying that Paul had a good slavery and what happened in America is bad slavery. What I'm saying is the Bible as a whole creates a disposition towards reality that should lead us towards liberation.